Thank you, Don. My purposes tonight are really very modest. I want to try to introduce this series by providing something of a theoretical background and framework in which to consider those substantive things that we'll be dealing with in the next several weeks. I want to describe something of the contours of the new leisure and of the critics and criticisms of the new leisure, and then also to anticipate some of the questions that will be asked and are being asked all the time about the leisure mass. Now, the first and most obvious of these questions is clearly, what are you doing here? Why aren't you home watching television? This I really don't understand. Checkmate is on right now. At 9 p.m., Danny Thomas and Stony Burke will be on. And at 10 p.m., Ben Casey and Loretta Young. You can get your uplift any way you wish it. Or to put it differently, why should leisure comprise such a problem that we would willingly give up our leisure time to consider it? The kind of question Mr. Meyer was posing. And put this way, the question emerges recognizably, I think, as one of the most serious and perplexing questions of our time. The problem crops up in every consideration of the human condition. Every one of the prophets of our society, and it's hard nowadays to avoid the prophets of this society, has made some pronouncement on this at one time or another. There's hardly a pundit or professor or a preacher or a public relations director, and these are all prophets, who has not had something to say about leisure. Louis Nizer, the famous New York attorney, said to the members of the Academy of Achievement, who were meeting at San Diego the other week, man's greatest problem in the next 25 years will be neither communism nor nuclear destruction, but leisure. And nobody, not even in San Diego, the home of the General Dynamics Corporation, and with a very large membership in certain societies that are concerned with the communist menace, nobody in San Diego laughed or thought this the slightest bit unusual. Or we read or hear on television that the AFL-CIO is sponsoring a 5-day conference in New York later this week, or rather this month, to discuss the constructive uses of leisure. And at the University of Chicago, there's a Center for the Study of Leisure. It employs a number of ologists, sociologists, psychologists, lots of ologists, with an enormous grant from the Ford Foundation to study the phenomenon of leisure. And all of this we take for granted. And the question really is, why? Well, now part of the answer is intended to be implicit in the title that I chose for my remarks tonight, The Theory of the Leisure Mass, or What Happened to Thorstein Veblen. For it was Veblen's incisive and at the same time, I think, wildly comic portrait, or caricature if you prefer, of the nouveau riche of his own time, and this is the late 19th century. His portrait of the Vanderbilts and the Goulds and the Harrimans, luxuriating in the riches of the emergent industrialism of the late 19th century. The portrait, this is to say, embodied in his classic, The Theory of the Leisure Class, published in 1899. It is that criticism, that portrait, that has come to seem like an accurate portrayal of the leisure mass of today. In Veblen's caricature of the leisure class and of its foibles and its follies, we recognize something of ourselves. Now, I take it the lines of Veblen's argument are clear and are familiar to you. This puts me on my mettle, you know. I liked it that way better. And that's the end of Meyer. You won't see him tonight. He uses his leisure time on electronics. That's the end of it. I haven't been able to use my television set ever since he fixed it. It's true. Well, Veblen's arguments, of course, and his characterizations of that society are familiar to all of us, whether we've read Veblen or not. We're all Veblenites, just as we're all, in some sense, Marxians and Freudians, in the sense that we've absorbed a good deal of the thought of Veblen and some of his argot. He saw, as he looked around him, an America that was split into two, that was divided between those activities that are productive and useful and those that are ostentatious and honorific. He saw a society that was divided between the honest labors of the working man and the predatory and pecuniary instincts of what Teddy Roosevelt called the malefactors of great wealth, the industrialists and the businessmen. By leisure, this is to say, Veblen meant everything that was not of the world of productive labor and of the workmanlike habit of life, or of mind. And for Veblen, the key event in the modern history of the leisure class was its involvement in the ownership of property, that is, private ownership. Originally, he tells us, predatory warlords seized property, and especially the women as the most desirable property of an enemy, and their ownership of the booty revealed the prowess of these war lords or war heroes. Property was honorific because it was an assertion of superior force. Eventually, the struggle for existence, and this is all according to Veblen's portrait, became a struggle for pecuniary emulation. That is to say, one could be known by those items of booty that were gathered to him. To own property was to possess honor, and it was to set up, of course, an invidious distinction between the person who owned the property and the person who did not. Popular esteem in this argument came to be based upon property and became, in Veblen's words, and he goes into these polysyllabic statements, the basis for that complacency which we call self-respect. Property, then, according to Veblen, was the beginning of the struggle for status, which, if I can find it here, was the beginning of the struggle for status, and the struggle for status had succeeded to the older struggle for mere existence. That is, it came about when there was excess property, when men were no longer engaged in the mortal combat simply for the purposes of existence. And in this situation, productive work was held to be unworthy, and the wealthy classes devoted most of their efforts to impressing one another by putting their wealth and leisure on social display. So we had those phrases that crop up again and again in Veblen. The phenomena of pecuniary emulation, men imitating one another in the demonstration of wealth, conspicuous leisure, conspicuous consumption of material goods, all of these as a means to ordinary decency. What was obviously expensive and wasteful of time and of money became the marks of achievement in the society that Veblen was castigating. Now, of course, Veblen's portrait is just shot through with spleen. It's vented all over his pages. And the spleen that we recognize in Veblen is due in large measure to his assumption that the accumulation of wealth at one end of the pecuniary scale implied privation at the other end. That is, that the wealth of the few denied a decent sustenance or even subsistence to the many. He assumed, this is to say, that the pie was just of a certain size, and that the wealthy were actually taking such a large proportion that the real energy that could be drawn, you see, from the rest of the pie was insufficient to supply the mass the opportunity to climb out of its rather sordid condition. Under these circumstances, the mass would be kept in indefinite subjection. All of which is to say that the moral edge of the phrases Veblen employed, a phrase like conspicuous consumption, was rooted in the economics of scarcity. Now, it may seem at the outset, or at least on the surface, that if Veblen's critique of the style of life of the leisure class has some valid applications to the leisure mass of today, the invidiousness that he speaks of is lacking, because, of course, we recognize that we're an affluent society and the economics of scarcity no longer seem to apply to us. Or to put this in the form of questions, can conspicuous leisure and material abundance be invidious when our productive potential has outrun our ability to consume gracefully? Or again, under the conditions of an affluent society, hasn't Veblen's criticism lost a good deal of its bite? Now, the simple answer to questions such as these is yes and no. And this is, of course, always the easiest kind of answer to such question. Yes, Veblen's criticism has lost much of its bite. The moral edge of his criticism has been dulled. But on the other hand, and this I think is important, abundance and affluence are not within the reach of every man, even in American society. Poverty and marginal subsistence have not vanished from the earth, let alone from America, or from America, let alone from the earth. They've merely become less visible at least than they were before, in the general aura of affluence. In other words, what has happened to Thorstein Veblen, if one thinks of this as a question, is that his criticisms have become assimilated to the conditions of the leisure mass. They've been tamed and domesticated to a point where they inspire less anger or indignation than a combination of anxiety and nervous amusement. In the words of, or rather in the works of the new critics, David Reisman, John Kenneth Galbraith, Vance Packard, William H. White, we all know these works. In these works, and these are very largely popularizers of the new sociology I'm referring to, one finds essentially bland restatements of Veblen's arguments without the moral imperative. Mass leisure is dangerous, we're told by its critics, because it emphasizes consumption rather than production, because it breeds conformity instead of individuality, because it leads to passivity and inaction at the expense of the active life, and because, finally, it brings about alienation and even the destruction, or at least the potential destruction, of the individual personality. That's the main burden of the criticisms that we read every day in our newspapers and in these popular works of sociology. Now, these, to be sure, are real criticisms and real dangers, but it seems to me that they fall short of describing the greatest danger of all, which is that the new leisure may be the means to the destruction of society itself, or at least to such a devaluation and trivialization of the meaning of society as to make it unrecognizable, at least as we know it today. Now, since Aristotle's time, it's been recognized that the tone of any society is very largely determined by the quality of its leisure. Whether leisure is restricted to the few, as it has been in the past, or is widespread as at the present time. That is to say, leisure is really at the essence of any society in its moral perspectives and in the face that it presents to the world and to history. In ancient times, leisure was regarded as the opportunity for wisdom. It was a positive value, and indeed it was the highest condition of life itself. Aristotle himself speaks of leisure, and he speaks of a leisure which is intimately connected with or related to work. He says we should be able not only to work well, but to use leisure well. For the first principle of all action is leisure. And then Aristotle, asking how leisure should be used, insisted that it should not be confused with mere amusement or recreation, except, of course, as a kind of medicine, you see. Leisure could be useful for that kind of purpose, but leisure, the kind of leisure he was speaking of, leisure as such, should be used to the end of pleasure and the enjoyment of life, by which he meant the life of contemplation and of intellectual activity. And we get some insight into what Aristotle really meant by the semantics of leisure in his society. Leisure, in its Greek word, was schola, from which we derive the term school. That is the English term school. It was in this sense that Aristotle was speaking. Leisure was the opportunity for disinterested activity, and it was the means to fulfillment in any society. Now, it's only with the rise of capitalism that leisure comes to be regarded as a negative value, as a form of non-work, as something which is done when one is not earning a living. As something, this is to say, which is useful only insofar as it provides recreation and regeneration for the tired worker to make him a more useful part of the industrial machine. With the rise of capitalism and the emergence of the Protestant ethic, with its emphasis, of course, on the moral duty of continuous industry, leisure became suspect. Now, in this sense, Veblen's attitude toward the leisure class is to be regarded, it seems to me, as simply the ultimate expression of an attitude which begins with Calvin and extends through the 19th century theorists, people like Marx and Carlyle. It was Carlyle, for example, who glorified work. He's of course, a kind of antediluvian throwback to Calvin. He glorified work and observed somewhat bitterly that a man with an income of £200,000 a year consumed the whole fruits of 6,666 men's labor, doing nothing for it but killing partridges. And then he went off, into Carlylean ecstasies of anxiety and so on about this. And Ruskin and his followers in the 19th century went much farther, demanding that every individual should spend some time each day in manual labor. It's only recently that a very few critics, people like Hannah Arendt in her book, The Human Condition, have sought to place some positive valuation on leisure as such, and to draw a distinction, which Miss Arendt is largely responsible for, between labor in the sense of production, and she calls it animal laborens, labor in the sense of production of consumption goods, and work, on the other hand, homo faber, man the tool maker, work in the sense of the production of the positive tools and the positive values of life. That is, work in the classic sense in which Aristotle and others used it. In short, at a time when leisure is becoming more generally available than ever before, we are made anxious by the dual legacy of capitalism and Protestantism, which of course pervades the criticism of Veblen, that legacy which insists on seeing leisure as a negative rather than a positive value. It seems to me that a great deal of the anxiety in American society today, particularly with regard to leisure, owes to this legacy. Now, for our purposes in this series, it seems to me that it might be useful to define leisure and to define it in positive terms as an activity of the complete man, the man who is free for contemplation, not the man exhausted by 12 or 14 hours of labor, or the man who has spent 6 or 7 days on a hurry-up schedule, or the man harassed by insecurity, or most importantly for all, I suspect, for those of us in this room, the man in the grips of a fear that he may not be using his spare time constructively. Now, of course, the dimensions of the new leisure are very familiar. It's a product, in the simplest terms, of time, increases in free time, and affluence. But mere free time and mere wealth do not make for leisure in our sense of the term. Automation and mechanic improvements in industrial efficiency have shortened the hours of work and lightened the burdens of manual labor, but that doesn't of itself create leisure, again, in our sense. Improvements in geriatrics and public health generally have tended to lengthen the span of life. It's hard to realize that as recently as 150 or 200 years ago, a man of 43 years of age, rather than being considered young for the office of the presidency, would have been one of the older members of the Constitutional Convention or of any political body, or that Cromwell at age 50, if we're going back to the 17th century, regarded himself as a very old and creaky sort of man. The average age, I think, of the framers of the federal Constitution was 41. And life expectancy, of course, was not at all what it is today. So that improvements in geriatrics have obviously lengthened the span of life, yielding more years for the enjoyment of life, but more years also to be used and for which to find constructive purposes. The real question, it seems to me, is whether the new leisure has been productive of leisure in the sense of our definition. We recognize that leisure time and the affluence to go with it holds an enormous potential for fruitful activity, for contemplation, for health and recreation, for solitude, for enjoyment, for human fulfillment. We recognize equally that it holds an enormous potential for mere consumership, for boredom, and the fruits of boredom, for apathy, for indolence, for vulgarity, for the debasement of the quality of life. And this is our dilemma. Now, these are the dangers, of course, pointed out by the critics of the new leisure. Some still emphasize and deplore the negative aspect of leisure. Clement Greenberg and others have called for an integration of leisure to work. They insist that leisure should be made purposeful. They insist that people should place the emphasis on squeezing their leisure time for the good of mankind, and so on. And then, of course, even more familiar than this emphasis is the emphasis of people like C. Wright Mills and William H. White. They emphasize the extent to which corporations, the organizations that employ us, the organizations for which we work, actually own us even when we're not engaged actually in our work. They insist that if the work week has been shortened to 40 hours and may eventually be shortened to 10 hours or 5 hours, this really doesn't matter because the corporation continues to own us and to control our style of life. And in a very real sense, according to this line of criticism, the large corporations are exploiting us as consumers, you see. The corporations have learned that if they're to exploit fully the productive potential of their factories, then they have to exploit the free time of the worker as well as his time engaged in production, so that it's equally important for the corporation to see that the worker has ample time in which to consume the goods that are being produced. And of course, in this sense, Americans have discovered that it takes just about as much work to consume goods as it used to take to produce them. And then, and sometimes one thinks more. And then, of course, these corporations insist, as William H. White has pointed out, insist on a certain style of life for their executives and for the people who work for them. They insist that wives should conform to a certain standard, that they should get involved in uplifting activities and all the rest of it. And this, of course, constitutes a tremendous lack of privacy or lessening of the privacy of the individual. These people, in short, emphasize the integration of work and play. Then there are still others, still a third category of critics, the foremost of whom are probably David Reisman and Margaret Mead, who insist that, in point of fact, the role of work and the role of play have been inverted, which is to say that leisure time and family activities have actually become the focus of life, and that work has become a kind of play, you see. One plays when one works when one plays. So that they conjure up the picture of the man enjoying his weekend or his 2 or 3 or 4 weeks vacation with pay, trudging around the yard carrying sacks of manure and all the rest of it, and engaged in hard labor and answering to the beck and call of the wife and the challenge, honey do. Honey do this, honey do that, and so on. And then, of course, this worker who gives over his time to repairing the appliances and all the rest of it that are supposed to be lightening the burdens of work around the home, gets back to work after the 2 or 3 or 4 weeks vacation with pay with a real sigh of relief. He can play his games again. And certainly if one goes into an automated factory or even a partially automated factory or a consulting firm, of which there are so many in Southern California, and observes the scene there during the hours of supposed work, one gets a sense of how work has become play. I recall vividly going into one such concern and seeing the IBM machine, and had a lot of little colored panels and buttons and so on that went on and off. And the men were all playing at this machine, turning on buttons and so on. They were physicists, and they had little blackboards in their offices that they could play with, and there were secretaries there that they could have coffee breaks with, and all. It was wonderful. And I've seen some of these same people at play over the weekend in the activities that I mentioned, so that the place of work becomes a relief from the burdens of home. Now, within the framework of these criticisms, we can, of course, observe much that's ludicrous, that's jarring, that is disturbing. The question of mass leisure is intimately bound up with the question of mass culture. And it's not a primary concern of this series to deal with the ways in which cultural values might tend to become devalued when culture is no longer the province of society, a leisure class. You see, society in the sense of an aristocracy, but culture has been taken over by the unwashed mass. But we see a great deal that is relevant to our concerns here. We see, for example, the American phenomenon, this is an invention of ours, of the senior citizen. What does that make the rest of us? I suppose junior citizens or practicing senior citizens or something of the sort. And the age limit, is being reduced all the time. You can become a senior citizen now at age 50. And what does this entitle you to? Well, it entitles you, according to the morning newspaper, to go and enjoy the luxuries offered by Leisure World. Or Palm Springs Panorama, or some such. That is to say, it entitles you to go off to a place where there are no lawns, there are green pebbles instead of lawns. You don't have to do anything. You can retire with people of your own kind, that is, other senior citizens, and indulge you can indulge in the activity of killing your leftover life. This is you can do it cheerfully, of course. You can come, you can aspire to utopia on the installment plan. We see a tremendous trivialization of free time and the kind of confusion that results from this. It's not unusual today to happen on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon upon a scene in a bedroom or a living room or a recreation room in which there is a man sitting over in the corner having 3 things done to him at once. He may be leafing through a magazine, listening out of one ear to a radio, and watching with his eyes a television set and a football game or something of the sort going on there. And if you ask him if perhaps he shouldn't be doing something with his time, well, he talks about how difficult it was to get to work and get back home from work. It takes an hour to commute each way, and work is really pretty burdensome anyway, and so on. Then, of course, we have the phenomenon of fun morality. And this, it seems to me, is a more serious problem. It consists in the anxiety over whether one is having enough fun. See, it's the anxiety that used to attend work simply transferred to the area of fun. So that we find people nowadays sending others off to have fun, saying have a fun time, not have a good time, and so on. And what does this mean? Well, it means that people become terribly anxious. I recall the cartoon in the New Yorker magazine in which there's a man standing in utter boredom at a cocktail party, and he's holding a half-filled cocktail glass in his hand, and he's saying to another man, "You know, I hate these affairs, but I want to look back on a happy youth." Or look at holidays. Now, it's simply not true that we have more holidays than more days off than people had, for example, in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, holidays were, of course, holy days, and there were some 115 of these during the ordinary year. Now, what has the holiday become in American society? Well, of course, it's become, again, an occasion for tremendous anxiety. You may have seen that quite remarkable and I think incisive article in Time magazine just at Christmas time. It was entitled "The Blight Before Christmas." And in that article, if you saw it, there was a very stirring discussion of the kinds of anxieties that attend the Christmas festival. All stemming, of course, from the necessity to have a good time at Christmas and to make something of it. In the modern world, says this Time magazine article, Christmas can also be the season to lose your reason. In this article, it was pointed out that, among other things, Christmas puts tremendous demands on everybody, and that within a very short time after the Christmas season, divorce actions rise some 30%, you see, and there is not just an accidental conjunction between these two. The demands have simply been too much. Beyond this, the new leisure tends to dull our sensibilities. It creates an atmosphere of indolence and acquiescence in the products of leisure. One finds in American society today that the problem of leisure is really the problem of how to heighten the qualities of experience in all aspects of life. And this becomes a very great problem when one considers that the atmosphere of life is itself a condition of the new leisure. The new leisure conditions our outlook on life. And insofar as it tends to dull our sensibilities, it tends to decrease the possibilities for realizing any of the purposes that people traditionally associate with human existence. The real problem of leisure is, it seems to me, how to heighten the qualities of experience to such an extent that there will be no problem of leisure left in American society. Over the next several weeks, you will have the opportunity to listen to people talking substantively about the conditions which have brought into being the new leisure. First, automation, and second, public health. Then Professor Robert Winter of the History Department will be talking about the architecture of leisure and the rather fruitless effort to incorporate into houses and buildings themselves conditions whereby we can achieve a fruitful existence and the rather ironic consequences of that. Then we will have Professor Vosper, the university librarian, and Professor Abbott Kaplan, who, as you know, is director of University Extension, talking about reading, the private quest, contemplation as one of the possibilities of leisure, and also about leisure and the arts. Then my colleague Donald Meyer will be talking characteristically about the game of sickness, and I leave you to discover what he means by that. And finally, the problem or the question of leisure as problem and resource. It seems to me that something we used to say as youngsters, which had no point then, has real relevance in the context of this series. The question used to be asked, who won the race? And the further question obviously was, what race? And the answer, you recall, was the human race. This was simply a mild form of youngsters' humor in another day. Today, it seems to me, under the conditions of the new leisure, that this question takes its place high in the ranks of sick jokes, and sick jokes insofar as they speak to the real ills of mankind, exemplify something of the anxieties I've been trying to suggest to you tonight. I want to take no more of your time now, but to open the floor to any questions that you may have. Yes.
Being a historian, can you draw any parallels between the amount of leisure civilizations have had and their continuation as a civilization?
Well, my first temptation in trying to answer this question, which you may not have heard, the question is, can I, as a historian, draw any analogy between the amount of leisure that various societies have had and their persistence as civilizations? My first temptation is to say that I'm not that kind of historian. But to be more serious about this, I think the phenomenon of mass leisure is absolutely unprecedented in human history, if by human history we mean the history since the rise of civilization. Now, the phenomenon of mass leisure has existed in the stream of human development before only in primitive societies. That is to say, in primitive societies, the distinction which we recognize between work and leisure was not made. And it was thought that all men should have access to leisure. There was a great deal more time given over to the ritual observances and all the rest of it, of leisure, than in our time. Since ancient times, that is, since the rise of civilization, the rise of cities, leisure has been the province of a priestly or aristocratic class, which has had all kinds of ceremonial functions and so on. And up to roughly the end of the Middle Ages, the value placed on leisure was a positive value. After the rise of capitalism and industrialism, and this was really in the fabric of my comments, leisure tended to become a negative value. Today, we're not sure. This is, I recognize, no answer to your question, partly because it seems to me that the phenomenon we're talking about when we talk about mass leisure is a new one to history. Do you follow? That is to say that even in times when indolence has overtaken societies like the Roman have become wealthy, that wealth has tended to be concentrated in relatively few hands. It's a difference in kind, it seems to me. Yes?
You mentioned that only private organizations like the CIO, AFL, or universities are concerned with leisure. If it is such a serious problem, isn't it the province of government then to try and solve the problem of leisure?
Well, I didn't mean to suggest that this is only the concern of organizations. Obviously, it's also the concern and the very deep concern of government. One could give, I should think, a whole lecture or essay on patterns of American leisure as exemplified by presidents, you see, presidential patterns of leisure, because presidents feel it necessary to set a kind of style for their society, so that when we're presided over by a president like Teddy Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy, we go on 50-mile hikes, you see. When we're presided over by Dwight D. Eisenhower, we play golf, and so on. Now, to answer the question rather more seriously, I think the government is very, that is, people high in the government are, and properly so, very deeply concerned with the problem of leisure. There's some question what can be done beyond trying to provide the conditions in which leisure is possible. This is where the government's made its peculiar contribution through Social Security and any number of other means. Does this answer your question
Right.
somewhat?
What would you suggest the government should do?
Well, what would you suggest the government should do?
I mean, as far as legislation or other...
I think really, you see, the first problem is to understand what the problem is, to define it. And I'm not sure that this is the proper province of the government. I think the proper area in which to treat this subject is the university and the public forum of various kinds. You see, we find that religious organizations are increasingly giving their time over to this, and so on. Yes.
Looking at this problem with which we are blessed in a worldwide context, isn't Veblen's moral imperative still just as valid today as it was in his time?
I think it is, and I hope I didn't seem to be suggesting otherwise. You see, it seems to me that what's happened is that the critics who've taken over much of Veblen's argument have obscured the point that you make. The analogy between the leisure class and the downtrodden in American society, the analogy between this in Veblen's day and the leisure mass today is the analogy between the leisure class and our mass in relation, on the one hand, to the downtrodden in American society, on the other hand, to the downtrodden the world over. Or to put it differently, the attributes of and the attitudes and instincts of the leisure class have become the attitudes and instincts of the whole of American society vis-a-vis the rest of the world. I don't know that I'm putting this very well, but I couldn't agree with you more. I quite agree. You see, it seems to me, it just occurs to me, it seems to me that really what Reisman and White and Galbraith and the others are doing is trying to make us like our leisure, see, and to allow us to be happy with our leisure. And it seems to me that the moral perspective that Veblen brought to this problem should figure much more prominently in our considerations of it. Yes, what was this
I was wondering
question?
if you have a reaction along these lines to Aldous Huxley's book Island.
I have not read it.
It is too complex a society that he portrays there, but it does go back to the primitive society as a base of naturalness and letting other things become a natural part of life, rather than leaving a very complex industrial civilization and trying to build recreation around television, baseball games, etc.
Well, you see, where it seems to me that Reisman and the others are extremely useful to us is in suggesting that we could seek and hope to achieve salvation only in our own terms and in the terms that our society makes possible to us. And it doesn't seem to me that any utopian scheme that would deny what has been built up, you see, can possibly achieve anything for us. That is, the real problem is to come to grips with our affluence and do something with it. Realize that this is a resource to do something constructive with, not simply to consume.
But do you think that we could learn anything from the primitives, or perhaps from the ancient Orient, in the way of integrating what we do have? In other words, might we find a sort of world outlook of our nervous system, so that when we do these things, it wouldn't disorganize us, but it could make us a more total human being.
Oh, I think there's no question about it. No question about it.
I think he's talking about sex.
Well,
I think that's what he's trying to bring out. I wish he'd say it.
well, of course, if you see, so long as the word sex has been introduced here, let's talk about it. This is a very real question, because I think in large measure with the breakdown of privacy which has come as a result of the kinds of things talked about by the several critics of the new leisure, the only intimate contact available to us, so we think, is the frontier of sex, you see. And it seems to me that a very large part of the mess that Americans have made of sex comes from the retreat to sex as the only part of life that can be meaningful. Now, I don't know if this was what you were getting at.
Feeling about enjoying the beauty of nature, for example, enjoying the moment that we're in, right in this room. There's a magic moment every moment if you let yourself, respond to it rather than waiting all day long to get free in order to find magic moments in some specialized activity. Rather, there's the happiness of everyday moments.
Well, there is the problem of cutting through our sophistication and our very knowledge. This is the theme that Abraham Heschel, of course, speaks about under the rubric The Awareness of Grandeur. I might say, just parenthetically, that Abraham Heschel will be visiting the campus on, I think, May 9th in the context of another series, so that you can get it straight from him. But among other things, Heschel talks about the real problem represented by sophistication, which tends and definition which tends to obscure the real grandeur of things themselves, you see. And he calls for peeling away much of this sophistication, peeling away much of the definition that obscures, so that we can confront life in the raw. And this presumably does not refer alone to sex, but to various aspects of life. And this, I take it, is what you mean. Yes? Well, I think it's perfectly necessary that we seize upon the opportunity for leisure as recreation, you see, and leisure also for contemplation, for solitude, leisure for relaxation. I'm not sure that in a society as highly organized as ours is, both in its leisure and in its work, that a very important part of this problem does not consist, you see, in the denial to us of the opportunity for relaxation. We always feel that we must be, as the sociologists say, maximizing every effort, so that I'd be the first to agree that the negative aspect of leisure is extremely important, you see. We talk about earning leisure, and we are inclined to think that only that leisure we earn, or we have been under the terms of a capitalist society, inclined to think that only the leisure we earn can be used to laze around the house and this sort of thing, you see. I'm not sure that that's true. This, I take it, is the great message of Galbraith in the Affluent Society, you see, in which he suggests that there are several answers to the problem, or to the problem created by the new affluence. One doesn't have simply to shorten the hours of work. One can make the conditions of work a good deal more pleasant, or one can provide for the release of a great many people from work altogether. 75% of all of the male population from age 10 to age 75 is engaged in work, according to Galbraith. You see, and he insists that this should not be true, that people should be, and a great many people should be released from work altogether, if they could find a meaning to put on the leisure time that they would gain. Follow? And of course, culture and the maximizing of cultural values would consist very largely in providing, in affording for increasing numbers of our people the opportunity to contemplate, to enrich our lives as well as their own. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, work can be dulling as well as being a tremendous burden physically, of course. And leisure is the only opportunity to provide some interest in the lives of people who are increasingly automatons. Yes. Well, the question has to do with education for leisure. And of course, we're engaged now in this series in a form of education for leisure insofar as we're trying to identify the problems of leisure. But of course, education itself, and I assume you mean yes. I think inevitably that education for leisure, in the sense in which you mean it, is going to have to be stimulated by those people who recognize the problem, you see. I think the first problem is to recognize the problem. The second is to educate people for the use of free time, to cast aside the old cliches and to cut through to new. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
The question I'm going to ask is not facetious. Did you write your speech in leisure? And if you had leisure, would you have written a different speech? It's assumed that free time is leisure. But I believe that most of the definitions that you quoted have indicated that any free time is leisure. A book by DeGrazia recently put out and indicates that very few people in our day do want leisure. They want free time, but not leisure.
Not leisure in the constructive sense.
Well, that means the lack of compulsion and the ability to do as one wishes. To write non-commercial poetry all day.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there is an increasing proportion of American society which aspires to a job or a position in life which provides a style of life within the framework of leisure. That is to say, a job which entitles one to integrate work and play, a job which will provide satisfactions and also will provide satisfactions that extend to the family as well as to the individual worker himself. Increasingly, in short, a large proportion of American society is entitled to leisure as a way of earning an income. Now, this is relevant to your first question because professors are among the most notorious and the most obvious of these. Our work is our leisure. we're among that very privileged class which can put its feet up on the table and think deep thoughts, or go to sleep and pretend we're thinking deep thoughts. Well, I don't know if I answer your further questions. Yes.
Well, you tended to underpin the role of the Protestant ethic establishes this idea of leisure as being a negative value. You've been indicating that it was the Protestant ethic that came out of the capitalist ethic of leisure.
I'm suggesting that these are really operating in very close conjunction, but in all questions concerning the Protestant ethic, I defer to my colleague Donald Meyer, and if he wishes to say something about this, I would be delighted. He stands with me. That cheers me. Yes.
Go back to something that you had said before about doing something about the problem and coming to grips with it. Maybe some of those who have voluntary leisure might think about those who have involuntary leisure and how to cope with it.
Yes.
There's a New Yorker article a couple of weeks ago on poverty in America.
Mhm.
by Michael.
You're thinking primarily of the unemployed, or
I mean, that those who have voluntary leisure might do some contemplation about the millions who have involuntary leisure.
yes. Well, this of course has been implicit and should have been explicit in my argument, because it seems perfectly absurd for a society which styles itself proudly the affluent society, and we have come to wear this as a kind of badge of merit, although our affluence is a product of no great genius of ours. For such a society to have such an enormous proportion of its people not only unemployed, but unemployed in the true sense of the term, that they're entitled only to bare subsistence while unemployed, you see. It seems to me patently absurd that this problem should not be confronted forthrightly. Obviously, a society which is affluent can afford to give to those people who are not employed, in whatever sense, the conditions of life. And I, again, can only agree with you. One thing that's being brought out by your comments, and which I intended to have brought out by cutting my own remarks short, is that we're all primary authorities on the new leisure, you see, and because one person stands up in front of a room and prepares some comments and talks about the new leisure does not mean that he's a greater authority on the subject than any other. We're all primary authorities on this. And of course, the simple answer or the beginning answer to many of the questions posed in this context is that we should all be giving some of our attention to this problem. I think with this we might logically conclude our formal proceedings for tonight, but I want to point out that in the lobby will be served coffee and
Got one question.
refreshments. I will take this one question if you think I should. Yes.
Comment was that I've been very careful for a definition of what the problem is that we've been talking about. And it seemed to me that we are not finding time to do some of the things we like or occupy ourselves. Whereas, on the other hand, it seems to me that the real problem is we have lots of leisure. Historically, when civilizations have had leisure, they have had a tremendous upsurge in their culture, in the things which have resulted in respect to art and in other beneficent values derived from leisure and creativity. And these are the values which I frankly have not heard mentioned this evening. I think a little bit is lacking if these aren't brought into play.
Well, again, if this was excluded from my comments, it shouldn't have been. It wasn't my intention to exclude this from my comments. On the contrary, one of the great opportunities of the new leisure is the opportunity to increase the creativity of the society itself, which is to say to achieve culture and not simply the debasement of culture. And the problem, it seems to me, is that we become increasingly passive in the face of the culture dished up to us over what somebody has called the womb with the view, that is to say, television. And this, of course, dulls our senses so that we lose the sense of purpose that could be arrived at if we hadn't achieved such leisure. I mean, this is, of course, central to my argument, and I would take it any argument concerning the new leisure. I quite agree. Well, this is just the beginning. We have 8 weeks to go.